Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. And yes, I said morning. We're starting about 5 minutes early today because despite the fact that we have a wonderful program that we're all looking forward to with Dr. Moore in just a little bit, today is the last forum program of the season. And as tradition, we have an annual meeting, and it starts off with a report from me. And please don't worry, I will try and be brief because that's the tradition of this organization, even if it isn't mine. About a year ago, this organization was strong internally. A small but solid base of people kept coming to our programs and supporting this organization. We were concerned because the numbers were getting less and less. So we negotiated with a friend of the forum, someone who had wonderful experience with us, who may or may not have just waved his hand, but nonetheless, we approached, with whatever budget we had, we approached Eric and we asked Mr. Squires to serve as part-time executive director. Well, we actually asked him to serve as full-time, but then we looked at our budget and we agreed that he would serve part-time. In the last year, because of Mr. Squires and because of a very solid, hard-working board, we have gone from 43 members to 76 members. I'm going to shift to give the treasurer's report. Our treasurer, Tim Hutchison, has a conflict. He has a meeting. He probably won't be able to get here, but he isn't here in time to do the report. So I'm going to simply read the report, and don't worry, it's not that bad news. But if after hearing the report you still want to make a donation, that would be quite acceptable. And our membership drive for next year starts right now. Anyway, annual meeting treasurer's report. The forum maintains two accounts. Our primary account is with the U.S. Bank, and this consists of basic checking and a CD. The secondary account is held with PayPal, which is used to facilitate credit card payments for member dues and donations. See, I'm asking you to sign up again. The majority of the forum's funding comes from member dues. Annual dues are presently $50 for individual memberships and $150 for corporate business memberships. The board, just at its last meeting, created a brand new special category called lifetime membership. And that is for $500. $500, you can be a member for life. And those of you that are over the age of 30 that are doing the math, don't worry about it. It's a really good deal. The PayPal balance is kept at zero as any cash in that account is swept into the U.S. Bank account. The U.S. Bank balance as of May 31 this year included $4,826 in cash and the $3,100, $1.23, however you say that, in the CD. Our total is $7,827.33. Any PayPal credit is charged a processing fee. Recently, the forum, due to the awareness and wisdom of our treasurer, was able to obtain a 0.75% lower fee from PayPal on these transactions by registering our nonprofit status with them. Membership is the largest element of the club's financial health. As of the most recent count, membership has now reached 76. As a nonprofit, all donations to the club, membership or donations, are tax deductible. Good treasurer, always throwing that in. The forum's fixed assets consist primarily of audiovisual equipment to facilitate our weekly speaker series and video each presentation, speaker furniture, and signage. All of this equipment is used. We estimate the net replacement value to be approximately $2,000. Last year, we are pleased to report we implemented procedures to monitor and report credits and expenses online. We also reviewed and structured all club accounts so that they meet nonprofit best practices for compliance, oversight, and transparency. Respectfully submitted by Tim Hutchison, Treasurer. Just again, to make this brief, we've done a few other things this past year. We have approached Pacific University and engaged in the beginnings of the development of a much stronger relationship. We're very interested in taking the mission of the forum to colleges, high schools, if they'll let us, because we don't think you have to be over the age of 30 or over the age of 60 in order to engage in civic engagement. I'm going to switch to the wonderful world of elections right now. And the forum's procedure is to have the past president, who is unable to be with us today, form a nominating committee a few months before today. She did that, and we do have a slate, and the slate will be read out to you. If we would have a nomination, the chair would accept a motion concerning the officers. Sir?
I move that the following persons be elected directors of the forum and to hold the following offices. President, Ram Solomon. First Vice President, Spencer Ehrman. Second Vice President, Elizabeth Furs. Secretary, Phil Nelson. Treasurer, Tim Hutchinson. And Director 2018, John Tyner.
Is there a seconder, please? Second. I don't know if our secretary got it. Thank you. Thank you for the seconder. And before I call for the question and seek other nominations, I would point out that there is one position also open after this slate, and we'll accept nominations from the floor. But are there any further nominations for these positions listed on the slate? Sir?
Would the president please repeat the nominees?
Certainly. I'll do it from here because I've got the mic. For president, Rob Solomon, whoever that is. First Vice President, Spencer Ehrman. Second Vice President, Congressman Elizabeth Furs. Secretary, Phil Nelson. Treasurer, Tim Hutchinson. Director 2018, John Tyner. That's the 8. Yeah, I'll get it to you. Sorry. Any further nominations on the slate? Then all those in favor of the slate as presented, please indicate by saying aye. Aye. Opposed, if any? Okay. Now, we have the position of Director 2019 open, and we're accepting nominations from the floor. Spencer.
I nominate Xander Holcomb.
Xander, would you wave your hand, please? Xander has agreed to serve. I need a seconder, please. This is Director 2019, Bill. And he's young enough to be able to complete the entire... I'm sorry, Xander, I just had to say that. At any rate, I was looking for a seconder, and I got one. I'm sorry. It was... Okay, great. Phil is second. Are there any additional nominations for Director 2019? Any additional nominations for Director 2019? I'll do it one more time. Any additional nominations for Director 2019? Nominations are closed. The election is unanimous. Xander Holcomb is Director 2019. You have your board for next year. Thank you so much for participating. I have one more thing before I have the extreme pleasure of introducing Dr. Moore. I mentioned his name twice, so you probably know who's speaking today. Ladies and gentlemen, we did reach out to, I don't know, we could call him Captain Forum if you like. We reached out to Eric Squires, and he's done a fantastic job. He's done what he was paid to do. He's given many more hours, much more effort. He's put up with me, and frankly, that really is difficult when you're trying to take somebody who is 62 years old and give them technological advice. It's true. It's definitely difficult, and he put up with me. So a few weeks ago, I was trying to think, what can we do? We can give him a certificate. We can give him a free lunch at the pepper mill. What could we do? The board, along with the board support, we discussed, and we came up with what we think is a really good idea, and it's my honor to share this with Eric. Eric, would you come up here, please?
Uh-oh. Hold on to the carpet.
We have a new category of membership. It's called Lifetime. It costs $500. And yeah, all of you were thinking I'm asking him for a check. It's not true. The board is pleased and proud to make you the first lifetime member of the forum at no charge.
Thank you. I'm a lifer. You may now not get rid of me.
I know he's going to be around to help us on a volunteer basis from time to time as we need him. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your patience. That's the annual meeting, and that's a wonderful moment for me to give that honor to Eric. Now I have another wonderful moment. This organization has been around for 60 years. One of our most popular speakers is with us today, and there's a reason he's popular, but I won't tell you. let him. Ladies and gentlemen, from Pacific University, Dr. James Moore.
You know, I have to be popular. I've been coming to talk to you for maybe 21 years or so. It's been a while. Today we're going to talk about the primary elections, which, quite frankly, in Oregon, there were some things that were fun. But really, the presidential stuff is the good thing. So we'll talk about that as well. But we'll be looking forward to the November elections as well. So primaries are good, but they move us into a place where we can begin to figure out what's going to happen in the November elections and then look at 2017 at the state level, national level, put all those pieces together. And so let's start with the state. We have a problem in Oregon, and the problem in Oregon is at the state level, we become a one-party state, which if you're a Democrat is great, and if you're a Republican is frustrating, and if you're the rest of the world looking at us, you keep saying, Oregon, isn't that where the bottle bill came from? We're still living off the fumes from the 1970s with our national reputation. And so we were looking, as we were going into the primary, so who on the Republican side is going to get into any of these statewide races and make a difference? We saw, for instance, those going up against Senator Ron Wyden running for re-election. No name, no name, no name, no name. And guess what? One of them actually won the nomination, a guy named Mark Callahan. Mark Callahan's claim to fame is he got third place in the Senate race 2 years ago to go up against Merkley. He's been a Democrat. He's been Pacific Green. He just likes to run for office, and this time he made it through a primary. Nobody's actually sure why, but he didn't have any strong opposition except for a Lane County commissioner who did well in Lane County and, oddly enough, nowhere else in the state. So we're not going to see a strong Republican go up against Ron Wyden. So the governor's race. Well, the governor's race was actually kind of fascinating because Kate Brown was not elected into office. Now, as many of you know, I'm writing Vic Atia's biography right now. And in doing so, I have done histories of every single statewide election in Oregon. And the last time we had an unelected governor going up to fill out the rest of a 4-year term was 50 years ago, 60 years ago. 60 years ago, I forget how old I am. 60 years ago, 1956. And in that case, it was a Republican governor had been in, he died, a Democrat became governor, and so it was kind of wild there. And then what happened in the election is actually the parties switched. So Kate Brown, if she looks at her 60-year-old history, should be a little concerned. We may have a party switch thing going on here, except that we've been waiting for who's going to be the Republican to get into this race. And so, it was all the usual suspects. Was Greg Walden going to come home and run for office? Would we see Gordon Smith come out of retirement? We've heard these names now for 20 years, and they're not going to run for governor. And so we kept waiting to see who would come in. And this guy named Bud Pierce from Salem said he would get in. He got in early. His fundraising was really phenomenal. He kept writing himself checks. And he was very successful in writing those checks. And then the name that's been out there for about 10 years is Alan Alley. So is Alan Alley going to get in? And Alan Alley was hemming and hawing. Apparently, behind the scenes, he was planning to get in, but he had to see how warm the water was. And he finally got in just before the filing deadline, about 2 months before the election. And so we went through that primary. Now, the remarkable thing to me about that primary, because you had Bud Pierce, who was self-funding and being very generous to himself. You had Alan Alley, who had actually support around the state and had his own funding mechanisms and was able to raise money independently. The amazing thing to me was how quiet that race was. If you're Bud Pierce, you need to introduce yourself not just to Republicans, but this is when Democrats and independents and unaffiliateds are paying attention. You need to be big and loud so in November we say, oh, it's that Pierce guy, isn't it? And the same thing with Alan Alley. You got to be loud and noisy so that you can get people to say, oh, okay, I remember the name. Here's why I remember it. Oh, okay, I think I should vote for you. And yet it was really, really, really quiet. They both ran television ads. The television ads were basically that they were nice people. And then as they saw the polling come through in their own private polling, the Pierce campaign pulled out the dagger to get Alan Alley with, which was that he had worked for a Democratic governor. And in an election where Donald Trump is the main feature of the Republican side, where outsiders are doing very well, that was a good tactic by the Pierce people. They came in and said, A, he's worked for a Democrat, so what kind of Republican is he? And B, he's worked in government. So that's a bad thing as well. And so Pierce came through and did very well across the state. Alan Alley apparently had no idea what hit him on Election Day when they counted up the votes. I don't think Alan Alley's going to come back to run for anything. This was a pretty clear message from the voters. Of the state of Oregon, when you look at the Republicans, you're a nice guy, but you're not the person who's going to lead us into whatever the future is. And so we'll talk about Pierce and Brown as we get into the November stuff. But just to kind of give it away, it's a real uphill battle for any Republican, and especially an unknown Republican, to win statewide office in Oregon. So we'll look at that and watch it. The other good fun one at the state level was Secretary of State. Now, Secretary of State on the Republican side, we had another Lane County commissioner. Lane County just keeps pumping them out to go run for statewide office. That's great. We had Dennis Richardson, who lost for governor 2 years ago. And they went at it, and Dennis Richardson, who had run statewide, won pretty handily, which is what you would expect. On the Democratic side, though, we had real fun going on. Now remember, this is the seat that Kate Brown would have been leaving had Kitzhaber not resigned. And Kate Brown leaving and the treasurer's race, which we don't really need to talk about because they didn't have a primary, that would have been Ted Wheeler also leaving that seat, both of them setting themselves up for a 2018 run for governor. But because of the Kitzhaber situation, we don't have that dynamic going on. And so we had Val Hoyle, Democratic leader in the House. We had Richard Devlin, Senate leader in the Oregon legislature. And we had Brad Avakian, who used to be in the House and the Senate and is now the Bureau of Labor person. And they went at it. And it was great. And they raised all sorts of good issues, but the main issue came down to the fact that it seemed every newspaper in the state didn't like Brad Avakian. Brad Avakian's idea of running for the Secretary of State was pretty clear. It would do almost everything except actually run the Secretary of State's office. And so he was going to do women's reproductive rights, and he was going to do environmental stuff and all sorts of great things that really resonate with Democrats, but they're not exactly what the Secretary of State does. And so the newspapers looked at that and said, what on earth are you running for? And didn't like him, and yet he won. Fairly predictable that he would win because he'd held statewide office. The other two have the problem that everybody in the legislature has. If you're known inside the building, in the Capitol building, you think that you're known outside the Capitol building. And you aren't. And they worked hard, and it ended up being fairly even. Kind of all of them were in the 30% range, but Avakian won. So here's the fun thing setting up for November. Early polling has Richardson significantly ahead of Avakian. This is the first time since we had Gordon Smith running for office in 2008 that we've had a Republican ahead in a poll in a statewide race. Now, Gordon Smith lost that race to Jeff Merkley, but there's something going on here. There's something going on here, and we're going to watch it carefully. Now, it's really early. The polling is wacky. Nationwide, it's been wacky as well. But it's something to really watch. At the legislative level, not that many fun races around. The only good ones were a couple of replacement races where people, for instance, Lou Fredericks in Portland decided to leave the House and run for the Senate, so there was a replacement race there. But this is an ongoing pattern that we've seen in Oregon. We've got 60 House seats that are up every 2 years. We've got 30 Senate seats, 15 of which are up every 2 years. And yet we probably, in those 65 or 75 races, we usually only have 5 or 6 that could possibly be called competitive in the primaries. It's kind of stunning. And it's still the number of them that don't have any opponent at all is still embarrassingly high. And that's got to change. It may be because Oregon, like the rest of the country, is seeing that politics is a dirty business and we don't want to get involved with it, and it's hard to recruit people. But it shows that we're not connecting kind of our civic activism with the legislative activism that needs to take place. And so on the legislative side, it was a fairly boring race. So switching to the fall, we get some fun stuff. So once again, Senate, nothing fun there. Mark Callahan is going to be run over by a steamroller named Ron Wyden. This I will bet the mortgage on, except I just paid my mortgage off last year, so I can't. But I'll bet my insurance payments. That's what I'll do. Governor, Kate Brown, just simply because of the demographics of the state and because she hasn't screwed up. I mean, that's a pretty low standard for us right now, but simply because she hasn't screwed up, Kate Brown should have no problem against Bud Pierce. But because it's the governor's race, and it is the most visible race, the Senate race is not, nobody's going to be paying any attention to it. Because it's the most visible race, it is also the one that is the most liable to be affected by national trends. So if Trump takes off, or the Republican Party morphs into something, or Hillary Clinton gets indicted, or something like that, it could actually have an impact on the governor's race. So Kate Brown can't look out there and say, oh, this is going to be a walk. She's got to prepare hard. And I think she is, because she's been pretty clear since she became governor. She, in effect, doesn't want to go beyond what Kitzhaber's agenda was until she actually has a mandate from the voters. And she doesn't have that mandate yet. So she's going to work hard to get that mandate. But it's basically going to be an uphill battle for Pierce. Pierce has been trying to say, I am in the mold of Tom McCall and Vicatia, yay. I'm the moderate Republicans you come to know and love. But it's been a long time since we've had moderate Republicans in this state. So by doing that, he's kind of appealing to people who lived here 30 years ago. The people who've come in since have seen a different Republican Party and different Republican candidates, and so that may not appeal to them at all. We'll see. We'll see. If this were the 1990s, it wouldn't work at all. The Republican Party in Oregon then was doing the social conservative thing, and very successfully. You know, they controlled both houses in the legislature. Couldn't win those statewide offices, but they were very successful. And so it's not clear how this Bud Pierce idea works when you look at the actual voters that are out there. Also, he's going to have to raise money from somebody that's not him, because it's expensive to run for governor. And I don't know how much he's got in the bank, but he's going to need to credibly raise probably somewhere around $8 to $10 million in order to run a credible race. This is in the range of what Chris Dudley raised when he and Kitzhaber went against each other in 2010. That's the kind of money we're talking. And you can't just hide out and say, hi, I'm Bud Pierce. You got to run ads that say who you are, why we should vote for you, all those things. All of that costs a lot of money. Now, the interesting twist in this, just this past week, during the summer of gubernatorial election years, there is a kind of a first debate with the newspaper publishers. They usually meet someplace at some fun place. They're the Oregon Gardens this year, which is a nice place. And Kate Brown has said she's not going to show up and do the debate. And in terms of her campaign, not that big one way or the other, simply because in the middle of the summer, the electorate's not paying attention. Rarely is news made at this debate, except that they had a debate. But in terms of going with her ideas that she's running on openness and transparency and she really wants to get a message out to the people, not standing up there with your opponent seems to be a confusing decision on her part. She should have done it. But that's my bias. One thing I've discovered doing the Atiyeh book, I'm a political scientist, I'm a political analyst. I want more debates. I want people to hear the sides. I want them to hear people engage with each other as if they're in a legislature dealing with other people who are in elected office. I want to hear that. Boy, candidates don't like that at all. And especially if you're an incumbent or you're ahead, they don't like it at all. And so Brown is in the situation where she's clearly the incumbent. She has a weak opponent. And so she just doesn't want to give him equal time. They will have debates. They'll figure it out. We'll probably get 2 or 3 debates that'll happen during the fall. They'll be at the usual places. Pacific University always puts in, come on out here. We've got great visuals. And I hate to break it to you, but Oregon's economy is in Washington County. It's not in downtown Portland. Come here. We usually get turned down, but someday I know we'll come through. So we'll hear them have a debate. But the first sign is that she's going to run a pretty strong incumbent-style campaign. And we'll see how that works. Once again, remember, this is where a Trump something or other could really sweep in and change the dynamics of this entire race. Secretary of State. So Avakian is behind in the polls against Richardson. Richardson, gave Avakian a hard time. He seems to be running for Secretary of State that doesn't do anything that the Secretary of State actually does. But Richardson is the same way. Richardson is running because he says Democrats are corrupt. Okay, so what are you going to do in the Secretary of State's office? Audit them? I mean, it's a very strange thing. We may be seeing a reversion to what the Secretary of State's position used to be, which became more clear when Kate Brown became the governor. The Secretary of State's position was the waiting place for people who were going to run for governor. So this was, Mark Hatfield did this, Tom McCall did this, Clay Myers did this, and then Vic beat him. Barbara Roberts did it and won. And so we may be seeing people kind of saying, oh, down the road, Brad Avakian might run for governor. Down the road, we might see Dennis Richardson run for governor again. Because they're talking about an office, and the way they talk about it is not what the office actually does. So it's going to be fascinating to see how that all turns out. On the treasurer's side, the most important thing here is a local boy. Tobias Reed is going to be running, so go local boy. But Chris Telfer is in this race. She's the independent who is going to try to be the first kind of independent party person to have a real shot at winning a statewide office. And so we'll see how that works. I've talked with you about the independent party before. When we talked before, it didn't have major party status. It now does. It's not clear how that major party status is going to convert into anything. The evidence so far is it doesn't really convert into anything. Their most exciting primary took place here because there was a House race in District 30 where write-ins wrote in 41 votes for each of the Republican and Democratic candidate on the independent ticket. And so that's great. 41 and 41, that's 82. By my calculations, there should be somewhere around 2,000 independent party people in that district, but that's whatever. And it was exciting because the county said, oh, you have to have a game of chance. And so they drew cards. And then they said, oops, it's a state office. We don't do that. You have to do it with the Secretary of State. So this last week they went and they rolled dice. And the first person rolled a 6. Guess what? He won the nomination. So we'll see what happens with that. The legislature gave the independent party a bit of a reprieve because we have motor voter registration, which added in tens of thousands, but not a huge amount into the primary system. It'll be adding in more tens of thousands as we get into the general election. The independent party is a major party simply because it meets the percentage that it takes to be an independent party. We're now greatly increasing the number of voters, so the independent party would fall below that key percentage. But the legislature said, okay, we'll pass a law saying you get to be a major party for the next couple of years, even as we do this change in the number of voters. So we're going to give you a chance to become a party, to actually begin to run primaries, win some local seats, do that kind of thing. We'll give you the shot. The history in Oregon of these kinds of third parties is abysmal. We'll see what happens. At least we're not California. I don't know if you followed California. They also have an independent party. Their independent party is a right-wing group that has a few neo-Nazis in it. The Los Angeles Times did a wonderful piece where they looked at who was registered in the independent party, and there were a whole bunch of Hollywood A-lister Democratic donors, and people said, oh, I thought independent meant I wasn't in a party. I'm going to get out of that party. Oregon, we have the same kind of dynamic with why people are registering as independent. They think it's unaffiliated, but we'll see. They may be able to get this group of people to come together, and that's fantastic. Once again, the odds are really, really against them. In the House, the Senate isn't going to change. Just let me tell you about the Oregon Senate. Not going to be any change whatsoever. But the House could change. There are 5 House districts in the state that could be competitive. If you do the math, that means if the Republicans win all of them, they'll be tied. So still, the Republicans can't take over the House, but they can definitely narrow the majority and possibly get to a tie. Remember, we had a tie a few years ago, and the House, in a delightful decision, voted to organize itself with co-speakers of the House. And actually, that was one of the most productive sessions we've seen in the Oregon House in quite some time. A couple of those races are going to be local. So District 30, where they had the flip of the coin, or the roll of the dice. This is where Joe Gallegos used to hold the seat, and he's left. Joe Gallegos was always a candidate who began to win by more and more, but he was a rather weak candidate. He wasn't someone who went out and really engaged people. It was more the identity of him as a Democrat. That's why I think that the Democrats are going to hold on to the seat, because regardless of the Trump effect of public opinion going up and down and sideways, demographics are what determines how people vote. And the demographics in Washington County have been shifting to the Democratic side for quite some time. And District 30 is kind of in the middle of that. Another seat is going to be the Forest Grove seat with Susan McLean, and she's defending. Once again, this was one that flipped back and forth for a while, but it seems to have flipped now kind of firmly into the Democratic side. And the reason I say that it's flipped into the Democratic side in District 30 the same way is because in Oregon, like the rest of the country, when we have presidential years, we have a higher voter turnout. And a higher voter turnout in Oregon means Democrats do better. On the off years, when we have gubernatorial elections and all the House and Senate elections, it's a lower turnout, and Republicans do better. So in 2014, there were several swing districts, 4 of them were up here in the Portland area, that had gone, when it was a down year for the voter turnout, Republicans had won, and an up year, the Democrats had won. 2014 was an off year, and the Democrats in each of those districts won, and they won handily. They were winning 45%. It wasn't even close. And so I have a sense that those districts, especially in the Portland area, the Washington County ones, I think the edge has to go with the Democrats, but it's going to be, Susan McLean has been in office now for a while, but it's going to be also how well do these candidates introduce themselves to the district. So if you live in one of those districts, you're going to be getting a lot of flyers. Maybe your cable channel will all of a sudden have ads going to you. What we've seen in the last several cycles, the candidates can find you on your email or on your browser, on your computer. which is always kind of fun. I look at a lot of international stuff. So there I am reading the latest Turkish newspaper, and it'll pop up saying, hey, remember District 30? It's like, how do you know that in Turkey? But it's because my browser and they know where I live. It's very, very strange. So as we go ahead, looking at kind of at Oregon and looking ahead to November, it looks like the Democrats keep control of everything. There's a question about the Secretary of State's race. It's just how much of a majority the Democrats have in the House. That's the big thing. So that's interesting and that's good, but that's probably not going to be the story of the 2016 election. The story of the 2016 election is going to be IP 28. Which will get an official number because I hate calling it IP 28. I want to call it Measure 32 or something. So IP 28 has turned in its signatures. They've got enough signatures. This is the gross receipts tax that John Kitzhaber worked very hard to keep off the ballot for at least a couple of cycles. Kate Brown either didn't invest the time or the people who were involved said, the heck with it, we're just going to go ahead with it. But whatever it is, it's going to be on the ballot. Now, here's the fun thing about the gross receipts tax. It will win or lose depending on how it is perceived by the electorate. They're going to spend a lot of money on both sides because they know that whichever message, and they're very simple messages, whichever message wins out determines whether this measure wins or loses. So here's the business community, which hates IP 28. This is the message they're going to put out there, and if they are successful, it will fail, and it will fail big. I predict it'll get at least 70% no votes. They're going to say it's a sales tax. Okay. Sales taxes in Oregon, the best that they have done is about 30%. The usual is 25%. The worst was Tom McCall in 1969. His sales tax got beat 89% to 11%. So if that's the successful message, this thing's going down. So the people who are behind it, who want it to succeed, they also have a plan, and their plan is we need to tax the big out-of-state corporations so they pay their fair share in Oregon. It's tax the wealthy for our programs. This was successful in January 5 years ago when we had the measures to raise the income tax on people, and it worked. So if that's the message, it's going to pass. We're going to get conflicting advertising, and the general rule in politics when you're doing this kind of advertising, big time, lots of money, is kind of the first group out of the gate establishes what the conversation is about. And then it's up to the other group to say, no, it's not really that, it's this. So if we see the union side get out there and say, it's a tax those big corporations, they need to pay their fair share, then the sales tax is going to have a harder time getting its message through simply because the first thing voters will hear is, oh no, those big out-of-state corporations, of course they ought to pay their fair share. And the same thing the other side. So watching when those campaigns start up is going to be a crucial thing to pay attention to during the summer. So we'll see. We'll see what happens with it. So right after the primary, I was on an analysis show with the leadership of the legislature, Republicans and Democrats, and we were talking about this, that, and the other. And as we brought up, Steve Dunn, the host, was bringing up, so what about this IP 28? And the Republicans came in and said it's a sales tax, and the Democrats came in and said it's a tax on big out-of-state corporations. And then he went to me and said, so what does this all mean? And said, well, that's the campaign right there. There's no doubt about it. So here's the fun thing about it. It is a gross receipts tax. Gross receipts tax is basically kind of an additional income tax or business tax. This one is 2.5%, and it's on corporations who earn above a certain amount. It's really going to hit the size of those corporations harder, and so that's fine. And it's kind of a funky thing, but here's how interestingly funky it is. Vic Atiyeh proposed a gross receipts tax in 1982. Now his was a 1% gross receipts tax. It was more on individual taxpayers than businesses. But his 1% gross receipts tax, if you do the math to bring it up to today's dollars, would have raised $1.5 billion a biennium. The one they're doing now, 2.5%, is about $5 to $6 billion a biennium. They're in the same ballpark. So isn't it weird that 30 plus years later, a Republican governor's proposal is kind of now the proposal of the unions to change our tax structure? I don't know what to make about that. I'll write an opinion piece for somebody or other about it and just put it out there and say, isn't the world a strange place? Vic's idea actually went nowhere. The legislature had hearings on it and said, that's a great idea. It's never coming out of this committee. And so Vic actually then changed and went for a sales tax for the first time in his life. And it was a sales tax, so of course it got beat 75 to 25%, and off we went. But that's really going to dominate what happens. We don't see any other ballot measures that are really going to have that kind of stature, and we're just waiting for them to kind of fall into place. July is when the deadline is for turning in signatures. But that's really going to be kind of dominant as we move along. So let's now switch to the fun stuff. There's this guy named Donald Trump. Donald Trump is running for president. If Donald Trump had not run for president, the entire conversation about the primaries for president this year would have been, look at the fracture in the Democratic Party. Look at Hillary, Bernie, look at kind of old-fashioned big money Democrats versus populist Democrats, all that. But Donald Trump drowned most of that out until he finally locked up the nomination. The nomination for Hillary Clinton, not a surprise. Something of a surprise that Bernie Sanders hasn't said you won. But that's okay. It's his prerogative. And once again, the political nerds are paying attention to this right now. But it's really, what does he say at the convention when he has a bigger audience? That's going to be the important thing. Just like it was 8 years ago when Hillary Clinton came and gave a bang-up speech saying Barack Obama's the guy, let's move ahead, these are our democratic ideals, off we go. So we'll see what Bernie Sanders does. I think he'll do something like that. There may be some negotiations over what parts of his ideas are in the platform and that kind of stuff. But as Bob Dole famously said in 1996 when he got the nomination, who pays attention to the platform? He didn't. So we'll see what happens with that. So that's good, clean fun. A bit of a disclaimer, I lived in Burlington, Vermont, and I voted for Bernie Sanders for mayor. He was breaking up a machine. I didn't vote for his first election that he won by 8 votes. I voted in his second election. That's when I moved there. I then moved to California to go to graduate school, and the next mayor I voted for was also breaking up a little machine in the little town. I voted for Clint Eastwood in Carmel. So I told people I only voted for mayor who were in Doonesbury. But the fascinating thing to me, because I've been following Bernie Sanders for a long time, and I know the other senator from Vermont, Patrick Leahy, the fascinating thing to me is Bernie is saying the same thing now that he was saying then. It hasn't changed at all. It seems now it's finally caught on with a big chunk of the Democratic electorate, and we'll see what happens to those ideas. The United States is an interesting place, but as a country, we're not a progressive leader in terms of policies and things like that. So it'll just be fascinating to see what happens with those ideas. If and or when Hillary Clinton becomes president, are they part of policy, that kind of thing. I don't think we're going to see anything at all like what happened with Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama. I don't think that if she wins, she's going to appoint him to be Secretary of State or anything like that. Apparently he doesn't know anything outside the country except where the Vatican is. So we'll find out what a future for Bernie Sanders looks like. But it's interesting. But on the Republican side, Tornado Trump hit, and the Republicans are just trying to figure out what to do. Is it a surprise that he hit? Yeah, because he tried before, and he'd been one of those people that got 4%, 5%, dropped out of the race. So clearly something was out there that he was able to hook onto. A lot of it, when we look back on it, is going to be that the other 16 Republican candidates, there wasn't a heavyweight among them. None of them. They all kept trying to say they were the outsiders. Trump is trying to say that. I'm an outsider. As I was explaining to somebody, if you've been to the White House Correspondents' Dinner, you are not an outsider. And every one of them had been to the White House Correspondents' Dinner. But that's the way that campaign goes. As Trump went along, though, people kept talking about on the anti-Trump side, how is he doing this? Are the rules wrong? What's happened to the party? And on the Trump side, he kept saying, why are you still in the race, you Ted Cruz person, you? You're trying to steal the race from me. The rules for the Republican primary were set 4 years ago after Mitt Romney won the nomination, and the rules were set up so that a Mitt Romney could win the nomination more easily. Because you may recall 4 years ago, Mitt Romney had to work really hard to kind of knock off the last ones as he was getting up there. So, for instance, they added more winner-take-all states. Okay? So when the Republican establishment, when Trump, when the other candidates complain, it's not fair, it's what you guys all created. It may not be fair, but it's the rules you set up. So they go through there. As we got to a place where Trump was going to definitely be the winner, and that was about mid-March. It became mathematically impossible for anybody else to win by about the third week in March. It took until May for the last people to drop out. But as it became clear, then we saw the dance that we're still seeing. Is Donald Trump a real Republican? Well, if you're a dyed-in-the-wool conservative Republican, no, he's not. He has been registered as a Democrat. He has lots of stances that are not what the Republican Party conservative side has been pushing for a long time. So that's one argument against him, but that argument had other candidates who were pushing it, and it didn't go anywhere. The other thing was, boy, he's got a mouth on him. And so what do we do with this? And as long as he was getting reinforcement from voters, he's not going to change because it's working darn well. But as we got to, okay, you've got your Republican electorate here, and there were a lot of states like Oregon where when we had our presidential primary, Trump got 65%, but remember, everybody else had dropped out at that point. That meant more than a third of Republicans said anybody but Trump. And that kind of thing was happening in other places. Some places like Idaho where it was a lot closer because they said, Trump, that's great. But it's an issue. It's an issue that's out there. And so we've seen Trump they tried to tame him. So he had his famous talk where he used a teleprompter after belittling everybody who uses teleprompters. And he didn't sound like Donald Trump. But the Republican higher-ups were saying, oh, thank God, he doesn't sound like Donald Trump. And then he took off after the judge, and the Orlando incident has not played in his favor, all these kinds of things. And so we have this weird situation where the Republican hierarchy, kind of symbolized by Paul Ryan, has said, he's our guy, but I don't like anything that comes out of his mouth. Now that's, at that level, we still don't know how the voters really feel about it. We're getting a sense that the voters are as fractured as the leadership, but we'll see. We'll see. It's dangerous at this time in any presidential election to predict what the outcome's going to be, although I'm going to do that in just a minute. And the reason is that we've had the primaries when kind of a small group of politically active people has taken part. And so when you put the Republicans and Democrats all together, you had somewhere around 40 million, maybe 30 million people voted in the primaries. We're going to have 120 million people vote in November. So we greatly increased the electorate. And so that switch from this small local state-by-state thing over a period of weeks and weeks and weeks to a single focus election that's going to have hundreds of millions of people in it is a big, big change. We know from public opinion polling in history that the polls before the conventions don't mean that much. You may recall in 1988, Dukakis was going to win, no doubt about it, and then we had the convention, and there was the famous Bush bounce, where he gained like 23 points in 2 days, and he went on to win rather handily in that election. And so we have to wait for that to happen. Now, it's going to be a little weird this year. Both conventions are in July, which for my business, which is to pay attention to those things, is going to be delightful. I'm going to be in Italy. So nobody can call me, nobody can do nothing. It's just I have a good time with the conventions. But there's a chance that the convention, especially the Republican one, won't be just a beauty pageant. Here's our beautiful candidate. Who did the beautiful candidate choose for vice president? There may actually be blood on the floor. Once again, if you look at history, we used to have this all the time. 1968, Nixon by no means had the nomination wrapped up on the first ballot, but he barely pulled it out. And there was big talk of Reagan, for instance, was taking a bus trip across the country just to show up in Miami Beach in case there were any issues that he needed to step in and maybe be the candidate for. That kind of stuff happened then in 72 and 76. 76 was when we had Reagan and Ford vying with each other, and that came down to a fight that only was resolved the night before the nomination. So we're not going to see any of that, but there are all these wacky ideas out there about saying, oh, if you're a pledged candidate, a pledged delegate in the Republican side, you don't really have to vote for Trump. And it's like, well, yes, you really do. They said, well, it's because of the rules of the party. No, your state has passed laws that say you have to. The laws win. But we'll see. We'll see. It could be fun. But whatever happens, I'll be making sure that the wine in southern Tuscany is fine. So if you have any questions about that, I'll tell you in August. So what's going to happen in this election? Hillary Clinton decided to get into the race in March 2015. We know from the year 2000 that opinion polls and whether or not Hispanics are going to do this or women are going to do this or anything like that, that's interesting, but the Electoral College is where it's at. So I sat down and looked at the Electoral College. And here's what the Electoral College looked like, and it looks like it to this day. If you put the Republican states, for sure states, Texas, the South, Idaho, you put them all together, and all the Republican leaners, you get 206 Electoral College votes of the 270 it takes to win. If you look at the Democrats, they start out with 216 for sure Electoral College votes. So the entire West Coast, Hawaii, states like that. And then when you put in the leaners, you very quickly get up to like 330. So regardless of Trump, regardless of Clinton, this was going to be a real uphill battle for a Republican nominee in no matter what. Can Trump change that? Man, he's shown that he can change things. But he's going to have to change things a lot in crucial states, and he can't waste his time in Texas. He's got to go to swing states, and he's got to change opinion polls, which have been pretty steady on him and generic Republican nominees for the past year and a half. He's got to change them by 15 to 20 points. Now, once again, he's shown he can do that, but he's been doing it in state by state by state. Doing a whole bunch of these states across the country is another ballgame. So right now, the Democrats definitely have the edge for the presidency, but we'd wait until after the conventions, we'd wait till closer to Labor Day to kind of see, so what's the baseline as people are waking up and paying attention to the race? That's when we'll begin to say, aha, here's where we think things are going, here's how we see the candidates responding, moving around. So the primary, yeah, that's great in Oregon, but the national one, this is going to be something, maybe it'll be my next book, who knows? So let's stop there and have questions.
Thank you so much, Dr. Moore. And people are already lining up. We have just a little time for questions, so we'll try and ask them quickly and I know you'll answer them really, really well. As a reminder, only forum members can ask questions. And if you're not a forum member and you want to pay up to ask a question today, you'll be paid up for the whole next season. And I will be quiet now. We have our first questioner.
Jim Cape, forum member. In April, the three candidates, Democratic candidates for Secretary of State, spoke, and they all said the John Kitzhaber case was a tragedy. Yet having an old guy fooled by a younger woman is one of the easiest tricks in the book. So should the John Kitzhaber cautionary tale be viewed as a tragedy or a comedy? Thank you.
At this point, it's an unfinished tale. The Kitzhaber case it's interesting because Richardson's going to try to make it an issue for the election. I don't think it's going to fly. He tried to make it a race, that kind of thing, an issue when he was running against Kitzhaber, and it didn't fly then. But remember, it's an unfinished story. We simply don't know what the feds are going to do, one way or the other. And when we know the answer, then we'll know, it was a comedy, it was a tragedy. The only tragic part of it right now is that John Kitzhaber was somebody who gave a lot to this state, had a lot of ideas. He's now beginning to come back out and begin to talk to groups and work with groups. That kind of institutional expertise and the expertise in his particular areas, healthcare and things like that, is missed. It's missed. But I'll tell you, when the feds report, which could be tomorrow, it could be 3 years from now, whether it was a tragedy or a comedy.
Hi, Jim. Emily Knupp, forum member. In my lifetime, we've had assassinations and we've had candidates meet stand-ins before a major election. What terrifies me is that we have a Clinton nomination and a Trump nomination, and something happens to Clinton after she's the Democratic nominee. What's the process for the Democrats if we lose our candidate before the major election?
Sure, and this is, assassinations don't happen very, very often at all, but people do die. And so people may remember that Wayne Morse won a nomination to take on Bob Packwood after Packwood had beaten him. Then Wayne Morse died. And the process is the same as it was then at the national level. The National Democratic Party will figure out who the nominee is. There's been some talk that it should go to the vice presidential person, but that person hasn't gone through the whole process of the primaries and things like that. So it's also not clear if they would call, for instance, a national convention to do that, or just the central committee would meet to do that. But it's up to the party to figure that out. In the case of Wayne Morse, this is where Betty Roberts came through and stepped in, and Packwood just rolled over. But it's something that people pay attention to.
Steve Buckstein, forum member. Just one quick comment and then a question. You indicated, as you stated about IP28, the 2.5% gross receipts tax, that it was on corporate earnings. It's actually on corporate sales.
Right.
And that 2.5% is actually larger than the earnings of a lot of the companies that it will hit.
Yeah.
Just a lot of the public may not realize that, but it is quite a difference.
Yeah. And this is in my book. I finally said there's so many darn taxes in here. I'm actually talking to 3 tax experts trying to get this straight in my head, and then how Vic thought about them. Because he often had ideas about the sales tax, for instance, which made no sense. He opposed the sales tax, but the reason he did, it's like, really? And so trying to figure that out is a job in itself.
My question is, you indicated in terms of the Secretary of State's office that Dennis Richardson has been talking or campaigning that certain politicians are maybe corrupt, and you weren't sure how that related to the Secretary of State's office, but one of the major functions of the Secretary of State, which gets almost no recognition, is the auditing function, both financial and performance. So I think it is appropriate for someone who thinks there may be shenanigans in state government to have control of the auditing function, and I just wonder about your...
Sure, no, I agree with you
that.
entirely on that, but he hasn't made that connection. That's the thing. He's got to make the connection. The way he's talking about it, it sounds like the Secretary of State's office is kind of the Attorney General. And so we got to see him make that connection. Now, voters don't really know what the Secretary of State does, so there's a lot of latitude in there. But it's something that opens you up to the other side. And Avakian is ripe for that kind of thing. But it's something that opens you up to the other side. You need to be pretty clear that you know what office you're running for.
Bill Kroger, forum member. First of all, thanks for coming today. You're always interesting when you come and talk with us, so thank you.
You're welcome.
I read in the New York Times today that Roy Cohn, who was the hitman for Joe McCarthy, the commie blacklist and all that, was a mentor to Donald Trump in New York, that he took him under his wing and really taught him a lot of stuff. And the article actually said that a lot of when you hear Trump talking, it's almost like Joe McCarthy in a way, tenor and stuff like that. Anyway, I was just wondering if you'd read it or if you could maybe comment on that.
Sure, I have read it, and I think it says more about Donald Trump not advancing beyond his early education, which as a college professor, I like it when my students move beyond me. But it brings up an interesting thing. We've been trying to figure out what Trump is, and because he's different than we've seen. I think you have to go. The closest thing to it was George Wallace in 1968, who actually third party. He actually won electoral college votes. Now Trump is going to win electoral college votes because he's going to be the Republican nominee. But we've been trying to figure it out. Internationally, people look at Trump and they say, we know exactly what we're looking at. Because here in Japan, here in Germany, here in Italy, here in all of Europe, here in developed countries everywhere, we have strong anti-immigrant parties. We have a strong anti-immigrant way of talking about things. And we have a populist role that moves through there. Now, one reason they have them in those places is they've got parliamentary systems with multiple parties. And so there's room for that kind of conversation. Just this yesterday, as a matter of fact, one of these kinds of populists was elected the mayor of Rome. And so that it's something that's familiar to them. To us, it isn't. And so we look back and say, oh, it's McCarthyism. Well, it's McCarthyism, but it's different than McCarthyism because it's added on the last 60 years. Or 70 years, if you look at McCarthy. He's been around for a long time. And so that kind of populism, that anti-immigrant message, resonated with a lot of voters. People say Trump doesn't speak for a country. Well, he speaks for, if he doesn't speak for the whole country, he sure speaks for a lot of people. You can't say he's not legitimate. He is legitimate. But that message is confusing for us because we thought we'd put some of these things behind us, but they're always below the surface. Always below the surface.
Hello, my name is Xander Holcomb, for a member, and as we've been moving forward, we've seen a lot of people move to the Democratic Party. A lot of people have registered for the Democratic Party, and a lot of that push has been Bernie Sanders. And so, wanting your opinion on how is this going to affect the Democratic Party in a system where you have a majority of people having a strong leaning towards like Hillary Clinton's idealism versus Bernie Sanders, which is more maybe independent kind of system and a long-term system. How is those voters who may be more leaning towards independent or more centrist kind of idealism affecting the Democratic Party, and how is that going to push through the elections and through this convention?
Well, short answer, I don't think it's going to make any difference whatsoever because the people who register for Bernie tend to vote only for Bernie and then they don't vote again. So unless they turn out to vote in November, we're not going to hear much more from this. Now, we've seen this kind of thing happen before. We saw it happen 8 years ago when over 150,000 people registered, mainly because of Obama. They raised the number of Democrats, and then they made no difference in terms of politics in the state, except they began to nudge some House districts over towards being Democratic. But the thing that I pay attention to is when 18-year-olds got the right to vote. So when 18-year-olds got the right to vote, there were some other things going on. We switched from multiple member districts in the Oregon legislature to single member districts. The environmental movement was actually beginning to focus in and begin to get behind candidates. So there were some other things going on, but there was a group of people who actually came in, said, we're going to change the world, and continued to vote. They did make a difference. But every group since then that's come in, regardless of the reason, age, ethnic group, whatever, they tend to say, this is my issue now, and then we never see them again. So I remain to be convinced that the Bernie Sanders voters are going to make a difference. Prove me wrong, but I just have to see that actually happen. November will give us a chance, but 2 years from now is going to be the real test. Just like the independent party. Can you be a real party? Can these Bernie Sanders voters actually stay in and say, we really do want to change the Democratic Party? You got to stick around.
This campaign for the presidency for me has been very painful. it seems like we have such short, vicious sound bites these days, and it's talking about what I call PP, personality politics instead of real issues. And Hillary Clinton was even criticized at one of the debates, I saw the end, by one of the commentators for spending too much time talking about policies. Is this, I mean, what are people really voting for, and is this anything new? I mean, are we really grasping what they're going to do, or are we just going to vote for whoever doesn't look as bad or we think is going to save the nation?
Exactly. So the answer to your question is going to be depressing. It began in the 1950s when parties began to weaken, and as parties got weaker after, for instance, we put in primaries. When primaries went in after 1968, all of a sudden it's not the people in the legendary smoke-filled room deciding who candidates are going to be. It's we the people. The power shifted out to the people. But the first candidate to really grasp how to make this work was Richard Nixon. So remember Haldeman and Ehrlichman. They were advertising guys. They sold Nixon like ketchup. And candidates now are sold like ketchup. So that PP that you talked about, that personality politics, that's what we look for. Remember George W. Bush? I'd like to sit down and have a beer with him. Okay? That's how people relate. There are still people out there who look for policies, but boy, it's tough to find them. It's tough to find them because the candidates know if you spend time on policies, great, so you got 10% of the electorate really excited. I need the other 80%. And there's the personality side of thing. And it's worked well for Trump. Hillary Clinton has been pushed to be more personality. So remember, this time she ran as a woman and a grandmother, whereas 8 years ago she said, "I've never heard of women." So it's the personality side, though, is what moves the big bulk of voters. Remember, we're going to 120 million voters now, and it's those sound bites. And then compound that with tweets and Facebook, rage and all that other kind of stuff. And it's just morselized into smaller pieces. This is why the rest of the world looks at this and says, wow, you have a great democracy. It's been around a long time. We're not going to select a leader like you do. Strong political parties in other countries. The platform does make a difference. People govern on the platforms. We lost that long ago.
Yeah, hi, John Tyner, forum member. I'm a lawyer. This is regarding the Hillary Clinton thing. Basically, the National Security Act provides for a non-mental state violation. In other words, you don't have to intend to publish secrets to actually violate the Secrets Act. In Congress, the Republicans have been trying to push to eliminate any crimes without mental states because they want to protect corporations. The Ds were a little bit loath to do that. So why would anyone think that given the fact that the statutes probably may disappear in the next session in any event, that the mental state issues, why would anybody think she's going to be indicted when Loretta Lynch is the Attorney General, Obama is the President, and the statute itself is going to be subject to change likely, especially when the Democrats realize that Hillary could be charged in this matter? I mean, it seems to me that's kind of a weird pipe dream.
It is a weird pipe dream, but it's a pipe dream. I mean, when you've got somebody like Hillary Clinton, and we saw this to a certain extent when George W. Bush was seen as the inevitable nominee in about 1999 as he was moving towards his nomination to win the presidency in 2000. You say, what can we get? And so with George W. Bush, it was, he evaded the draft. And so we'll try to figure that out, and the net result of that was Dan Rather lost his job. But when you get to the Hillary Clinton thing, yeah, in terms of policy and law, it doesn't make much sense, but it's not about that. It's about having an issue and moving voters. The problem with the secrecy stuff with Hillary Clinton and her server and all that is twofold. First of all, it only riles up people who wouldn't vote for her anyway. So it doesn't get to the middle. It doesn't get to where you need to shift voters. And secondly, the thing that hasn't really been covered, which is remarkable to me, is since the invention of email, basically every Secretary of State before her did the same thing. So that's famous liberals like Colin Powell. So it's a political thing. It won't really move anywhere unless there is an actual indictment, because if anything comes out of Congress, it'll be seen as partisan, and it just will get the same people who don't like her anyway. So that's where we stand.
Thank you so much, Dr. Moore. Really appreciate it. And thanks for squeezing in so many good questions, and thanks for taking the time and the care for some really good answers. Ladies and gentlemen, this is the last program for the season. We'll see you in September. Before you go, I'm warning you, you'll be getting your membership renewal letters, and the only way to stop it is to grab an envelope on your way out and renew right now for next year. And folks, one more thing. I so much appreciate the support of the board that I've had this last year. I also appreciate the support of the members. Thank you for giving me another shot for one more year. Take good care. We'll see you in September.